Good evening, viewers. Thank you for joining Shastra Summit's Talk with the Top. Before we begin with the much awaited talk with architect Rahul Mehrotra, I would like to give a brief introduction about this masterclass series in Shastra Summit. The summit is the flagship event of Shastra, the annual technical festival of IIT Madras, which provides a networking platform for its participants to interact with pioneers of today and opportunities to enhance their expertise. With a lineup of lectures, panel discussion, and workshops spanning over 3 days with the help of our esteemed partners, we have successfully impacted the society and the concerned community. Every year, Summit ventures into a unique and relevant theme to contribute to the developments in these fields of technology and to create an impact on the society. Previously, we have successfully organized Defense Tech Summit earlier this year, Sports Tech and LawTech Summit in 2019, Green Energy Summit in 2018, Accessibility Summit in 2017, and the Maker Summit in 2016. With this, we are proud to announce the theme for the summit this year, with our logo reveal. The theme for this year's summit is Architect Summit, which brings together the fields of architecture and technology. The architecture community is always bustling with new and creative ideas for various designs of buildings, open spaces, and other artificial constructions. And with the unfortunate outbreak of the virus, developments in architecture and planning have never been more integral. With developments in technology like virtual reality, 3D printing, and advancement in material sciences, Shastra 2021 hopes to help bring these technologies to light, which would help our participants advance, innovate, and upskill in the field of architecture. We'll start with the fireside chat in a few moments. We
Okay.
would like to introduce the first speaker of the Talk with the Top series, the renowned architect Mr. Rahul Mehrotra. He is the founder of the Mumbai and Boston-based architecture firm RMA Architects and is professor of urban design and planning and the chair of Department of Urban Planning and Design at the Harvard Graduate School of Design in Cambridge, Massachusetts. His notable projects include software campus for Hewlett Packard in Bengaluru, a campus for Magic Bus, restoration of the Chowmahalla and the Falukhnama Palaces in Hyderabad, and formulating a conservation master plan for the Taj Mahal with the Taj Mahal Conservation Collaborative, amongst others. We're honored to have you for this talk, sir.
Thank you.
Sir, so we'll start with the questions and the presentation now.
Sure.
So from starting your own practice in 1990 to becoming the chair of Department of Urban Planning and Design at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, you started teaching 15 years into your career. So what made you transition into an educator?
Oh my gosh, good question. A complicated one. Yeah, I mean, I studied architecture, I studied urban design, and I really never thought about teaching. Although I was always interested in research and history and writing about the city, and I did that for I think about 15 years. and also was very actively involved as director of the Urban Design Research Institute in Mumbai, doing advocacy work. We were doing documentation projects. We were organizing lectures, conferences, and I suppose all of that really kind of indirectly prepared me very well to teach, although I did not consciously see that as a trajectory in my career.
Hmm.
And as they say, life is what happens to you while you're making plans. I met the dean of a university, University of Michigan. His name was Doug Kelbaugh. He said, "Look, you've been doing all these things. You should really teach. Why don't you come and spend a semester with us?" I went and I loved it. And I think in that one semester, which was in 2000, I kind of overnight discovered that teaching is something that I would be very passionate about. And I suppose one thing led to the other, and that became another trajectory in my own career. And I began to combine teaching and practice. But in retrospect, I realized that all that work that I was doing without really a goal in mind in terms of wanting to become a teacher had prepared me unconsciously for that. So when that moment arrived where I had an opportunity to teach, it kind of just uh, was a natural fit, so to speak, and have not looked back ever since, because it's now become something that I consider a part of my being, and I spend a lot of my time thinking about teaching, pedagogy, and very much enjoy my time and learn a great deal from students.
So that's a very thoughtful answer. So moving on to the second question. So architecture is the physical manifestation of society's aspiration in a broader sense. So this interpretation of yours is very different from what common people perceive of what architecture is. So what do architecture and urban planning mean in this modern world?
I mean, if you think about it, I mean, what do we do as architects and by extension urban planning, or urban planners and by extension architects? I think society invests in us, invests in you, and has invested in me, is investing in you. And we are, I think, charged by society, in a sense, we are charged by society to imagine better spatial or more productive, better, more humane, more equitable, more just spatial arrangements in which we as human beings who live together in communities um, can spend our lives. And so this notion of imagining better spatial possibilities, I think, is an important one, because every society has its own aspirations about how it wants to relate to each other. That's what forms societies, that then constructs culture. And I think architects and planners play a very, very important role in imagining those possibilities, those spatial possibilities. So if you think about it, planning, I mean, how you organize a city, whether it's how you juxtapose uses, or how you imagine the urban form of a city, as
Hmm.
by extension urban design would do, and down to how you imagine the house, it can all make profound differences in people's lives. Now, those differences can be sometimes very tangible ones, which means you provide good ventilation and you create healthy environments, for example, or you create efficiencies through the appropriate use of technology and passive cooling and passive heating and all of that, and you create a better existence for people spatially. But also intangible ones uh, that have to do with how people relate to each other in those formations. So in the way, the relationship of rooms, the notion of privacy gradient between the street and the inner aspects of the house, it all makes a massive difference in the way finally societies and different people who are organized spatially in a particular way will or not intersect with each other's lives, right? And so these spatial possibilities, and the idea that space matters in the way we exist, in the way we live our lives, and the way we relate to each other, is a very critical dimension. And I think that is a very important aspect of what we do. Now, of course, there's how you deploy technology, the imagery, and how do you extend traditions, and what does locality mean? I mean, there are many, many complex questions embedded in that. But I think essentially society charges us with imagining better spatial and better formed related possibilities in which we can dwell as human beings and relate to each other.
So, sir, talking about architecture in the modern world, architecture has the power to bridge the gap between people of different social and economic backgrounds. One of your projects, that is the KMC corporate office at Hyderabad, which has a garden wall around the building, does astounding work in bringing people from different economic groups together. So, what is the message behind this project?
So, I mean, if you're going into projects, let me just flag out a few issues which might help us understand these projects. And so there are three or four very important things that guide our work, or at least have made me think about our practice in a particular way. And I think many of my collaborators in the practice, I think also subscribe, believe, have helped me expand this imagination. So the one is this notion that context matters, which is what you see up on the slide. And context does matter. I think this pandemic has shown us how much context matters. The pandemic has shown us how much we must value locality, right? But often we, as architects and planners, we have a rather narrow view of context. So we take context, if you're designing a house, it's the site. It's maybe if you're ambitious, you talk about the embedded histories of the site. You talk about local materials, climate, etc. But every context also sits in a broader context, and that broader context is many more intangibles of politics, of well, not intangibles, but much broader, more complex issues of politics, of culture, of where society is going, of economic policies and ideologies that drive the politics. And this is a very complicated, ever shifting kind of container, in a sense, of the context that we kind of begin to get obsessed with, which is our street, or with it, even our city or our house, or a site, etc. And so how we create this intersection between our understanding of the specificities of a context and the broader context it sits in. So what is the critical question is, what is the context of the context? And I think this sort of going back and forth between these scales and between these levels of complexity and tangibility and intangibility is very critical in how we should nourish how we think about architecture, right? The second question is, which is related to it, is how do we make the spheres of our concern intersect with our spheres of influence? And we have to keep calibrating this, which is, our spheres of concern go all the way from climate change to, healthier environments to broad planetary concerns almost, right? But our influence usually is very minimal. So we might, at the end of a conference like this, we might go out having expanded our spheres of concerns enormously, but we don't know how to act. And therefore, the real question is we must keep calibrating these, because otherwise we slip into cynicism, we slip into pessimism, and it's not very productive. And so I'm not saying that we should minimize our aspirations, but what I'm saying is we should be strategic about how those concerns and aspirations in the broadest sense can be instrumentalized by us as professionals, whatever that profession would be. It could be an architect, it could be a civil engineer, it could be a doctor, it could be, a politician even. And I think this calibration and this balance is very critical. You can yet hear me, correct?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay. Then the third, I think, question, which again extends from this, is the notion of, what we use so simply, local and global. And I think the pandemic has forced us where this has kind of reversed. Suddenly, the local has become the most stable entity in our lives, and the global has become so transient, right? And,
Yes, sir.
and we can't see this as a binary, correct? And I think the way we imagine our responses in architecture is how our aspiration is, how do you localize global programs? So, when you have global programs, whether they're IT centers or whether they're corporate offices, how do you make them part of the locality? How do you not just get seduced by the tyranny of images and just transport images from one place to the other, which is what's happening, and Photoshop allows it so easily.
mm,
And as Charles Correa, the architect, used to say, he said, architecture is not a movable feast. He said, music is a movable feast, but architecture is not. It has very much
mm,
to do with locality. And so the challenge is, how do you localize these programs? Because these are programs that don't come out of our tradition. These are programs that have been invented globally.
mm,
Even the idea of the workplace, for example, how do you localize it? And then conversely, how do you globalize local programs? So very local problems, which might have to do with a creche in a slum, or might have to do with community toilets somewhere, or it might have to do, with a very specific program. How do you actually think about that program in the way that the lessons that come out of the locality can also resonate globally? So again, then you blur
mm.
that binary between the local and global, right? And
Yeah.
so, and then the last two things, which are much more grounded and founded, and I think these 4 5 ideas will help you understand my responses to projects,
Mm,
is that we also have this binary where there are architects who are doing very precious things, like private homes and boutique homes and weekend
mm,
houses and farmhouses. It's like 1% of what gets produced in the built environment. I call it the architecture of indulgence, and it's good. I mean, we learn a lot from doing it. I've done many myself. They become incubators and for innovation in terms of detail, material, all
mm,
of that. And then we react to that and we become advocates. We become barefoot architects. We kind of work with alternate practices. We, work with NGOs. We work with the poor. Absolutely fantastic. And I think the problem is that if you begin to create these binaries, uh, as a profession, we are not effective. And I think we should be doing both. I mean, these are not mutually exclusive domains of focusing our energies. But there's also a mainstream which lies in between, which is institutions and corporates and working for developers and for the government and for faith-based practices and all these incredible modern temples in India. Actually, shifting the mainstream is where we will really affect the way our built environment looks.
mm,
Without moving and shifting the mainstream, you're always on the margins. And the alternate practices, the advocacy practices, as well as the boutique homes, can feed into preparing us how to work in the mainstream. And so these kinds of intersections, whether it's between the context and its context, between the global and the local, between these different streams of practice that we begin to swim in by default sometimes, is very critical to recognize. And then the last thing I'll say is a more recent realization that we often look at our client as a homogeneous entity. So we say,
mm,
oh, we've got the client. But if you actually look at it, the client, the notion of the client, or the form you would engage by the client with the client, and the way you would understand the client, has to be kind of much more nuanced, right? So if I just go back to this image, um,
mm,
the kind of clients in the mainstream are quite different from the clients in the boutique homes or otherwise, right? So what
mm,
basically happens is, say in a weekend home, the client is often one person. At the most, it becomes a couple, right? And you kind of negotiate with them. And sometimes it's difficult, but at least it's frictionless because your client is identified. In a government project, like we did a project for Hathigaon, which we might talk
mm,
about, the government was one part of the client. I would say that is the patron client, the client who has an aspiration to build something. It could be the chief minister, or it could be, the MD in a corporation, etc. And then you
very good.
have the operational client, and the operational client is, the building department in a corporation, or the public works department in the government, or a campus engineer for a campus
Mm,
project. And then the users are the people who actually use it. And often in that mainstream, these three don't talk to each other. They have very little relation to each other. And so, how the architect negotiates between these three to get the understanding of the aspirations of all three, and to be able to synthesize that I think is what makes for successful projects. Often we get trapped by working with one or the other. Either we work only with the user and then we are always at loggerheads with the patron client, or we work with the patron client and no one else is interested in what we're doing, or we get seduced by the operational client because it's the most pragmatic and practical thing to do, and then we don't serve the aspiration of the users and the patron. So these aspects are absolutely critical to understand and to foreground to be able to effectively help society imagine those spatial possibilities. Yeah.
Hmm.
So you asked me about this building, and I'm sorry that I had to preface all of this, but it'll, I think, help our
Hmm.
conversations. Yeah. And you should
Yes,
stop
sir.
me if I'm going on too long. Just tell me to move to the next one. You can be rude. I won't mind it. Uh, so the KMC building, and this image is very emblematic. It was an image taken by a trainee who came from Panama City, and he saw this more clearly than even we saw it, which is this idea that the least paid workers, in this case, the gardeners who look after the facade, can actually intermingle visually so easily with the bosses in the corporation. So you could have a conference happening in the conference room, whereas these guys could be walking around, and that creates a form of empathy because they get to know each other. The presence of the lowest paid category in the corporation being adjacent, albeit separated by glass in this case, sometimes that glass is open when there's a sliding window and there are conversations even, allows what I call for uh, in architecture, the idea of a soft threshold. Thresholds can separate us in very dramatic ways. And I think the challenge for us in society, especially in India and South Asia, is how do we soften these thresholds? Because the disparities in our society are so large that through architecture, we actually create exclusion. And I think that is what, for me, this building, by default, I mean, we didn't start out by saying we're going to make a building where there's a
Hmm.
soft threshold, where the lowest and the highest can mingle. But we started doing things more by understanding many aspects, all the way from technology to society, and then making decisions that we felt were consummate with those sets of values. And so it's a building in Cyber City. It looks at high-tech infrastructure. This is what they would have liked, and the fishing nets support protect the glass from being
Hmm.
broken if there was a riot. It basically is a double facade. It's not a green wall by sticking green on the building, but it's a
Hmm.
double facade. That actually it's the old cuss principle, where the cuss was used to cool the houses in a hot, dry climate.
Hmm.
It allows the facades to be organic and to grow. Each facade can be different. The facade is independent of the building being occupied. We made the facade very low tech, but using recycled aluminium in a little factory with a small contractor outside Hyderabad. And that's how the building sort of evolves. It also has organizational principles, which, it's too little time to go into all of that. But it begins to create a kind of atmosphere that's interesting. It also is, in many ways, it does more than a building like that you see with a shiny facade, which has got a LEED certificate. We didn't get a LEED certificate, but it does much more in terms of social intermingling, but also in terms of creating a new aesthetic and also creating an atmosphere and a cooler environment as a result of all of this. So, these are really the heroes of the buildings, the gardeners who look
Hmm.
after the facade. And the identity of the corporation depends on the least paid workers, which is an interesting uh, it's an interesting reversal, in a sense, of some of these questions. And so it's a performative facade. It creates a sense of misting, and if you want, or it's hydroponic trays really. So the water used is very minimal. The misting is done once in a while just to cool the skin of the building, but it also creates a nice atmosphere on a hot kind of on a hot day for everyone to, in a sense, enjoy. And that's what the building sort of aspires to do.
So, sir, you talked about Hathigao in Jaipur, Rajasthan. So, it is a project designed with the elephants and their mahouts as the client. So, it is certainly one of a kind. So, where do you take inspiration from for projects like these?
I think I think for us the inspiration for that program, and here's this. This is the project.
Hmm.
Is it's multi-faced in the sense that I think um, we very quickly identified that the weakest link or the weakest player or the weakest voice in this process of the project was the elephant and the mahout. You know, the mahout are very poorly paid. They usually are from the Muslim community, so they're a minority. In Rajasthan, I think that means a lot in terms of being marginalized. And this was a competition. And in the competition, I think we identified two aspects that inspired us. One aspect in the competition that we were very inspired by was this idea that the mahouts and the elephants work hard, and they were given housing, like you see in this image, which is like a car garage. The mahout and the elephant have a very close relationship, and that's why the mahout started coming and living downstairs in beds in that veranda you can see, so they could be close to the elephants and not live on top of the elephants. And so this protagonist, or this sort of part of what I was calling the client, in this case the user, was someone who was very unempowered, and so we felt they should be central to our imagination. And the second thing that we felt was this question that, I mean, elephants shouldn't be in a desert climate. They're tropical beings. I mean, they came to Jaipur as kind of default through the Mughals, through, ceremony, through parades, through warfare, through many other reasons historically, maybe even before the Mughals, I'm not sure. And so therefore, how does one actually create an environment for tropical beings in a desert climate, right? And so I think, so therefore, landscape became very central to our imagination, and we made it really a landscape project. So our competition entry were drawings like this. They were drawings that showed how we could actually create an environment that would replicate the sense of the tropics, not only just as an illusion, but also to keep it slightly cooler perhaps, but also to be able to trap water, because water was very important for the elephants, and the relationship they have with the mahouts, because the mahouts bathe them, and things like that. So that's what inspired us to take a site that was like this, a desert kind of climate. We looked at Google Images. We could see streams of the few inches of rain from Jaipur. How could we trap these? How could we create an ecology that would begin to kind of generate the site? And, you have to, I think, in projects like this, which are very complicated, complicated because the client itself is many entities. You have many things to synthesize. You have many unknowns, many things you don't have a control on as an architect in terms of deterministically figuring out or proposing. And so therefore, what you at best do, and the way I describe it, is you set up an armature for life to thrive, and you set up processes that might even go to another direction that you might not anticipate. But as long as the values, I think, embedded and the priorities embedded in setting up that armature and those processes are relevant, are an understanding of the context and its context, an understanding of what the dynamics of the client might be, how you understand the client, and how you bring value to what is a very specific and local program. This only happens in Jaipur, but how could some of those lessons resonate broadly? And in this case, the lesson of how the landscape design and the landscape imagination can actually lead the way the project and the site is organized. And that's what we did. So the landscape took the primary space, and in the interstitial spaces where we put the architecture and the housing. And so that was a kind of transformation we achieved from 2007 to 17, just because of the water and the sense of humidity. Of course, we focused on the housing. We looked at it incrementally, how it could grow and expand, and how the courtyard could be shared, and how what by the government stipulation was a 350 square foot house, because of the courtyards, could really feel like a mansion. So this is 3 houses being shared. How the materials, the storage of food, etc., might be creating insulation, which might cool the house. So those big roof canopies, which really shade where the elephant lives, but also allow air, the hot air, to escape, also are designed so that food can be stored on top of them, which is hay, which means it would also create another level of insulation. And so each courtyard then sort of develops on its own. And I mean, I think, like I showed you that image of the gardeners, for me, this is a very powerful and a very symbolic image, because of the water, here the poorest who earn 5, 7, 10,000 rupees a month and less sometimes, actually have lawns and have green and can sell flowers, whereas the middle class in Jaipur are buying tankerfuls of water because they don't have
Yeah.
water. So suddenly, just by default, by giving them access to water, you reverse an inequity, unconsciously. I mean, I didn't start the project by saying that's what we are going to do, but I think because nature and water was so central, that equity gets flipped. And so I think this is the power of architecture, to be able to, in subtle yet powerful ways, begin to transform the environment for people. And now here you don't see the houses painted, because when we took these photographs, they were yet allocating houses. They were really on rent, but you can see the elephant there. Elephants can look out of that window, so they can also participate in the social life of the cluster. And that's a before and after from the same view. So you see the kind of transformation from really a desert to, an environment with trees and water, and that's Kikar, and these are pavilions where they have to socialize. And this opportunity, the young teenagers of the children of the Mahout used as an opportunity to start a company called Elephantastic, where people can pay to feed the elephants or to bathe with the elephants. And this is a process that has gone on over 17 years, and you can see how it's slowly evolving as different governments come and give money, don't give money to the project. I think it'll evolve. It'll go somewhere that I mean, I might not even know, but the point is that there's a process that has been set up which allows for an environment to transform, in this case, in response to very specific clients, let's say, or user clients.
So, sir, moving on to the next question. So most of India's mega cities, take Mumbai for example, have a stunning skyline with a huge number of skyscrapers. But then we also see the slums of Dharavi. This apparent economic difference has been a planning problem in Indian cities for a number of years now. So with the rapid urbanization that we are seeing in India, is India's approach towards architecture wrong?
Well, I mean, actually here you have to step back a little bit from architecture. Architecture comes out of its context, and it comes out of the context we create, and comes out of the context of the context. And I think where we have failed in India in the last, I think, 20 or 30 or 40 years or more, is the way we've imagined our cities. In cities, land is owned disproportionately. The house size is disproportionate. So the biggest families get the little houses you see at the base of the photograph, and the richest families get a lot of space, sometimes a whole building for 4 people, as you know. And so that inequity, I think, has been manifest very sharply in the built environment. And really, I mean, I think, and of course, this can become a lecture in itself, and I don't want to go into it, but I mean, I'll just sort of, just outline a principle or two, and you realize where we've gone wrong. And which is, well, first is there's a holy kind of tripartite, I'll call it a trinity, for lack of a better word for the moment, which is it's livelihoods and dwelling. So livelihoods and dwelling are very interrelated, right? And what connects them is mobility, right? So if you have a shop house, the mobility is very minimal. It's zero. You walk down a flight of stairs and you're in your place of work where you get your livelihood and you live above, right? In our cities, what happens is, as cities grow bigger, they get more complex, they get more get more pluralistic in their function and their purpose. And what I mean by that is, Chandigarh, for example, when it started off as an idea in a city, its single purpose was it was a government center. And so that's why you had, from the 50s and 60s and 70s, those images of thousands of largely Sikhs and Punjabis on cycles, cycling to work in the hot kind of avenues of Chandigarh, because the workplace was the capital and everyone else lived elsewhere, right? The same was for Mumbai, when the mill lands and the textile mills and the ports were the biggest employers. Everyone lives elsewhere, and they all went to one place of work. Now, when that happens, you can actually predict the modes of mobility, right? I mean, in Chandigarh, it's inefficient. It should have had a mass transport. It didn't. And so this relationship between livelihoods and livelihoods and dwelling, and then the mobility systems that connect them is actually, you look at any city and you apply that question and you'll know whether it's efficient or it's inefficient.
mm,
And I think Mumbai, in spite of the mess and the kind of lack of planning, it works because it's a long thin island with a central spine of a railway system which allows for a lot of efficiencies, correct? And so
mm,
by default, Mumbai manages to survive. Now in Chennai and every city in India, they're trying to put these mass rapid transport systems,
mm,
which are coming after the fact, which means now people know what is happening when they're trying desperately to connect all those points, but the city keeps changing. Actually, mobility should drive the growth of the city, not follow the growth of the city. Then you begin to have these interestingly robust, or not interesting, but robust relationships which allow for those efficiencies. And I think when you have a mismatch there, then you begin to start having imbalances in the supply and demand of
mm,
land. You begin to have a mismatch between where the jobs are and where housing is, and they're not connected. And that's what gives rise to slums, because people want to occupy space to be close to their livelihoods. And
mm,
therefore, even if they have to sacrifice living conditions, it helps them with their income. And so then it, of
mm,
course, becomes a very complicated question. I don't want to go there because I don't want to oversimplify it either. But I think for right now, what I would say is I think it's planning that has failed. And if you don't create if you don't create the right context of the city, then the context for architecture is very limited. And then it results in high-rise buildings, etc., which are responding to the context of high land values, and which is then perpetuated with all sorts of other structural problems like dysfunctional land markets, the nexus between politicians and developers. I mean, those are all the results of this context that we have by default set up.
mm. So, sir, moving on to your study of the Kumbh Mela, called the mapping of the ephemeral megacity, which is a study on the temporary city at Kumbh, which is built every 12 years for the festival. So, what are your biggest takeaways from that, and what is the concept of a kinetic city?
So, wow, that okay. No, no, that's all very interesting questions. I must say, you guys have really done your homework on everything I've written about and everything I've talked about. So I'm very impressed and very grateful for such a well organized set of questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you,
So
sir.
the kinetic city, for me as an idea, when I studied architecture and I studied urban design, I was I was trained, I felt, and much later that one could see this retrospectively.
Mm,
You believed that architecture was instrumental in making cities. You believed that architecture was the central spectacle of the city. You believed that through urban design one could create the forms that would determine the way people lived. Like I said in the beginning of this talk, the spatial possibilities, etc. And while I was even studying urban design, I was always uncomfortable with that singularity, almost dogmatic belief in the power of architecture and urban
mm,
design. And while one wants to believe, and of course one does believe that architecture and urban design can both, and planning can both, and landscape architecture can all be very instrumental in organizing our lives, we have to also understand their limits. And I think that's the humility we have to bring to the profession, because otherwise we bring an arrogance that actually marginalizes us and
mm,
doesn't make us more instrumental. And I think we have to be very careful about that understanding. And I think everything I showed you in the beginning of the talk, of the context and its context, the local and the global, understanding what stream you're part of in terms of the mode of your practice, as well as understanding the client, are all very, very important ways of understanding the limits of architecture in a sense.
mm,
And so I began to talk about, actually, in the initial years of my research, of the binary. And the binary is always a very useful way for us to organize the world and understand everything around us. The rich, the poor, the
yeah.
state, the public, the private, oral traditions versus literary traditions. We can set up a million binaries and the world becomes very clear to us. And so therefore I, in my mind, also set up the binary of the permanent and the temporary in terms of the form of the city. And I was kind of seeing the city and writing about the city and writing about the history of Mumbai and understanding its architecture really through that lens.
mm,
But at some moment, I felt that there was something which was very unique about at least the South Asian city, because that's the area I know, and I think this could extend elsewhere, which was that actually the temporary city was forming a much bigger percentage of what I saw as what was happening in the city in many parts of India and South Asia, right? So that was one. And the other was that and so therefore the extension of that question was, so therefore how does one actually design for space for the temporary, right?
mm,
Because I was seeing maidans that became, wedding venues for 24 hours and they disappeared,
mm,
but it was all kind of surreptitiously done. And I was kind of asking myself the question of why can't we actually design cities where there are many spaces that only have temporary use and are not locked into permanent zoning, for example, right?
mm,
And so that's how I began to kind of look at the idea of the kinetic city. And for me, the kinetic city is got a few characteristics. One is that in the kinetic city, which is how I used to that would be my way of describing actually South Asian urbanism much more broadly, is that it has a sense of elasticity, which means space is elastic. It expands and contracts. Places get occupied and deoccupied. And therefore, there's a question of reversibility. And so therefore, the notion of reversibility becomes very critical. And how does one start? So I'm sorry we broke, and I think pardon me if I pick it up incorrectly, but I think we broke when I was talking about. So I'm sorry we broke, and I think start. Hello, hello.
yes, sir. We can go on.
So okay, so I broke at the point where we were talking about the kinetic city, and I was just sort of ending it by saying that the broader rubric that I'm imagining this under is the notion of flux. That is, how do we design for flux, for this changing
Mm,
condition? Because are we then, I mean, I think the critical question is, are we making permanent solutions for temporary problems and vice versa? And
right.
and that sometimes architecture and urban design can be the problem, not the solution. So we have to be wary about that. And I think if we create that kind of humility, I suppose, for lack of other word, I think we will be more rather than being aggressive and arrogant, in a sense.
Mm,
And so that openness is, I think, what we have to bring to the practice. It must realize its value as it lands, and that's why people build buildings quickly. It's dry construction, it's curtain glazing, it's materials that can arrive and manifest themselves very quickly. And these are very brittle forms. Singapore, Shanghai, Dubai, these are all landscapes of impatient capital, so to speak. And this tyranny of images, we just lap up without understanding, again, the context of the context. And I think by understanding the context in a different way, you can kind of resist it in a sense. And I think
mm,
that is what gives us that instrumentality. In the kinetic city, on the other hand, there are other spectacles. Architecture is not the only spectacle of the city. And these festivals, for example, are amazing spectacles that actually define the identity of the city. They're temporal in character and nature. They leave, sometimes they leave a pollutant trace which people are trying to correct, but they don't leave the trace in terms of permanent footprints, And so
mm,
the Kumbh Mela, which you asked me about, was really a study which looked at this aspect. And we were fascinated by the fact that there was a whole mega city that was reversible, that kind of implied this design for flux, etc. And, what did
mm,
we learn from it? This could be a lecture in itself, and I can't go through it. But that's how it appears from a watery kind of landscape. And when the sandbanks appear after the waters recede post-monsoon, the city appears on the sand. It's a perfect grid. It's not a pop-up city. It's a very deliberate city, which is planned for a whole year before that. And this is
mm,
before and after images from the same spot, where within 6 or 8 weeks, this actually, let me correct myself, about 12 weeks, that is post monsoon, from October when the water starts drying up. In December, November, it really the site reveals itself, and by December, actually a whole city appears. It's a city with 7 million people who live there, and another 100 million that visited. It employs a grid which is scientific, it's technological in that sense. Every road goes across the river in a pontoon bridge, so it's got the most robust mobility system. In other cities like even New York with the grid, you have the bridges going across in 3 or 4 places, but here every road goes across. So which means even if the river shifts, if there's a flood or there's an unseasonal rain, the stability of the city as a mechanism, as an operating mechanism, stays sort of intact, and it replicates all the infrastructure of a regular city: social infrastructure, cleaning staff, roads, hospitals, so physical and social infrastructure. And it has an incredible plurality in terms of imagery, right? What is interesting, and these are the 2 things I'll just highlight, which I always highlight because for me they're the most exciting, which is the fact that it was just built out of 5 materials, all the dwelling units basically, which is 8-foot tall bamboo, rope and string, a skinning material like plastic or a corrugated metal, etc. And so it can be assembled and disassembled very quickly. And that 8-foot pole that you see here in red, and you see how it actually, in terms of scale, can be deployed. So in a sense, this is low technology. It is intelligent and smart technology, but it's low tech in the way that we otherwise imagine technology, which is interesting. It's a kit of parts. So it's systemic, it's structural imagination, if you deconstruct it, is very clever and very smart. It doesn't rely on high technology in terms of either information technology, which of course the Kumbh Mela deploys for its other forms of management, but not for its dwelling. And here, these are the kinds of things, this is all the same 5 materials, but it has such incredible variations. This is a temple, a temporary temple. That's a memorial, for war heroes, but in which there's also prayers and yagna done. This is a kind of prayer hall. The other thing that I kind of wanted to point out is its management. So, what happens in cities, we say, oh my God, the cities, the architecture, this is a historic city, the architecture is what has kept the city in its imagery stable and it's more permanent. But actually, if you think about it, more than architecture, often in cities, governance systems are the more static things. They don't change so easily. And that's the reason why cities are not prepared often for disaster or for climate change surges or for many other things where cities break down. In the Kumbh Mela, in the beginning of the year, the chief minister is at the head of the pyramid, in a sense, and the chief minister gives orders to all the bureaucrats that you see in yellow and in red. And then over time, that keeps shifting. And so halfway through the planning, basically what happens is the divisional commissioner becomes in charge, and the divisional commissioner starts giving orders, which you see in blue, to many vendors and agencies. And he or she is reporting to only 2 or 3 people on the top. So which means the hierarchy flips on a temporal scale. So 6 months later, the hierarchy is now, therefore you can't imagine this as a pyramid, but a circle. And then 3 months before the Mela opens, it moves to the Mela Adhikari and he becomes in charge. And the Mela Adhikari then reports to the divisional commissioner. He reports to, one other person within the bureaucracy, and he has direct access to the chief minister, right? And so therefore he or she becomes very instrumental. And then, of course, at the end of the Mela, it goes back to the clearance and then it disappears. And this governance structure then gets reestablished 4 years later or 12 years later, depending on the complexity of the Mela. Because after all, it leaves no memory, it leaves no trace. When the monsoon comes the following year, again, it all gets kind of washed out.
So we'll move on to the next question. So being an advocate of leaving a light ecological footprint on Earth, how do you approach sustainability or say green architecture in your work?
So look, I think for us, I'm kind of let me situate it with first a cynical remark, and then we'll try to answer your question. And the cynical remark is that, what has happened with the whole sustainability debate globally is that it got hijacked, I believe, by the high techs. So what do I mean by that? So if you go back to, I think for me, the origins about the debate on sustainability can be traced back to the 50s and the 60s, where you had very good Western architects like Jane Drew, and you had a number of people who were being funded to work in what had been the British colonies or the colonial kind of empire, right? So a lot of very interesting work came out of Africa, out of manuals that were written by Jane Drew and things. And then we, of course, had a whole generation of Indian architects. Charles Correa's famous essay where he said, form follows climate, in a sense, because everyone was talking about form follows function and all of that. And he wrote an essay in Architectural Review, I think in the 70s, which was Form Follows Climate. And he had been very interested all the way from the Tube House about circulation systems, the Parekh House, and all of that. But this was all a generation of architects, and that means Correa and his contemporaries. I mean, architects he learned from, like Jane Drew. Jane Drew was one of the jurors for the Tube House competition, so she recognized the value of the Venturi effect and the funnel of air and wind, and so this was a whole. I think there's a whole discussion there which was based really on low-tech, passive, arguing for low-rise, high density as efficiencies of technology, material, lifestyle. There were many, many questions. But somewhere in the 80s, I think the high-tech architects hijacked, I believe, the debate on sustainability, which then got propelled by a whole green industry. So finally, in the 90s and 2000s, what we inherited was a debate on sustainability where we were made to believe that there was a chemical or a mechanical fix to any problem. So you could design the dumbest glass box, and then you could have double layered insulated glass. You could have more efficient sealants. You could have air conditioning that had greater efficiencies. You could clap and your lights would come on and go off so that you could save on electricity. You could time electricity out, etc. So I think this is unfortunate because I think it really didn't take us, I believe, in a good place. And so therefore for us, I think I see sustainability as being a more complicated and not such an objective challenge, meaning you can't say, okay, here I tick off these 6 boxes and I've solved the problem. I mean, I think the Greha and how we have adapted the leads to the Indian context is far more intelligent because it does create space for some of these parameters. But also, I think it needs to have a social dimension. It needs to have a dimension of how the building or whatever you're judging for sustainability also is an armature for social life, and to bring people together, to imagine better spatial possible. These are all a bit more intangible and can be less objective. So let me say, in our work, I think the way we address it is just by bringing good values, trying to solve the problem using as intelligently as we can understand materials, using a lot of recycling of materials. We spend a lot of our energy doing conservation and renewal work because we believe that maintenance, repair, restoration, recycling should all become much more part of the mainstream than it is. It's all boutique on the edge. Oh my God, he restored so-and-so and he did a conservation project and he used lime, and we celebrate and fetishize those things. But I mean, I think repair and recycling should even happen with ordinary buildings. It doesn't have to happen with just what are called historic buildings, right? I think we have to change our mindset where the solutions don't lie only in making new, but the solutions could also lie in retrofitting. And I think that has to become a very big component. So our response to sustainability is a kaleidoscopic one. It's one where the patterns for us that we think have importance shift. For us, the age of the building doesn't matter as much as just the approach. And for us, I think maintenance and repair, restore, conservation, recycling should be celebrated much more within the mainstream discourse of architecture than it is being done currently.
So that's a very relevant take on the topic. So could you also elaborate on how various technologies like 3D printing, modular architecture, and rapid prototyping are facilitating this shift to sustainable architecture?
So, I mean, I think that's a complicated question because we are on the edge of it. So we don't know. We don't have the luxury of hindsight to be able to think about how one might retrospectively analyze its benefits and pros and cons. But on the face of it, I mean, I think anything that brings systemic thinking, anything that can help us think systems through will help us create more robust environments. Now, 3D printing in itself, I'm not sure. I haven't thought these issues out. I mean, I think when you have complicated labor markets, and when you have cost differentials that are huge in many, Western parts of the world or the global North, or however you might want to kind of classify that, or economically more affluent countries, maybe labor costs sort of make it all relevant, right? In certain kinds of 3D printing, maybe if it's hazardous, it allows a detachment of labor from these processes. But I mean, I think it's linked a bit to what we imagine as form, right? So if we start imagining forms in a particular material with particular technologies, and of course, digital printing, 3D printing, and all of that will become the way you could service those indulgences or those aspirations, whatever it is. But if you imagine form in different ways, which can be more handmade, which can be more intensive of labor, which can be of more organic materials, it takes you in another direction, right? So in some ways, it depends on that commitment, and therefore I come back to where we started, which is it depends on the context in which you're working, and that's why locality becomes very important. It also depends on how you understand the context of the context, because I think we have the instrumentality to mold both those in some ways through our understanding of both. And therefore, I think technology has to be deployed appropriately. And I think that is key. I think all forms of technology are simultaneously valid. It's their deployment in particular localities that give them wings or don't give them wings, or give them relevance or don't give them relevance, or make them relevant or irrelevant, and therefore establish their future or not. And therefore, I think really if I had a single line to respond, I would just say context matters. Context matters for design, context matters for the form, context matters for the technology you deploy, and context matters just generally for our well-being.
So we are nearing the end of the chat. As a final question, can you elaborate on what major changes will be faced by young architects in a post-pandemic world?
I mean, I think in the post-pandemic world, whether you're a young architect or a middle-aged architect or an old architect or a retiring architect, and architects never retire, luckily, but I think that for me, at least, the value of locality, the value of home, and the way we make the relationship between home and the world, I think is something worth thinking about. I think we would. I hope we will necessarily realize that locality matters. I think how we relate to place and how we can contribute to that placemaking without being seduced by what is happening everywhere in the world, just for the sake of being seduced as an indulgence by that, I think is going to be the critical check. And I think how we build our neighborhoods, how we reimagine our cities, how we think about questions of equity and many other such structural problems which have surfaced in great exaggeration and in great amplification, sorry, that's the right word, in the face of the crisis and the pandemic. I think we should learn from that. this is a good moment to see how, as human beings, we can address those questions. What the pandemic has shown us is the business as usual is only as business as usual and as normal as you accept it to be. It has shown us new normals, and therefore it has also given us a glimpse of how we can change the world and not just take it as granted. And so therefore the reality that surrounds us is what we make. And the deeper we understand that reality, the more critically we think about it, I think the better equipped we'll be to actually change it.
Sir, so we have reached the end of our chat. So thank you for this inspirational and informative talk. We thank our viewers for attending this talk, and we hope that you enjoyed it. We have some very exciting talks and events planned ahead, so please stay tuned. Follow the Instagram and Facebook Shaastra page and help us spread the word. Thank you.
Thank you, Abhinav. Thank you very much.